are fortunate to be supported by 6 organizations in this event: West Marin Environmental Action Committee, Shore Up Marin City, Marin Audubon Society, OFA Marin, San Rafael Sustainability Program, and the Point Reyes National Seashore Association. So we've chosen to partner with these groups because at EFM, our goal is more than to provide an environmental education. We also want to inspire action. And to that end, these sponsor organizations have put together a list of actions that you can take to support them in their efforts to lessen the impact of sea level rise on Marin. We'll be providing that list to everyone after the event, and we hope you'll consider following up with our sponsors. So on to the event agenda. First, we will be hearing tonight from Terry Green, the director. Oh, sorry, okay, there we are. First, we'll be hearing from Terry Green, the director of Shore Up Marin City, on how sea level rise is already affecting her community. Next, Dr. Kristina Hill will talk about how sea level rise and groundwater rise threaten the built environment of Marin. Dr. Katharyn Boyer will then tell us about some of the nature-based adaptations that could potentially help Marin. And finally, Dr. Stuart Siegel will ask our speakers some of the questions that you've been sending in. So we aim to wrap up on time before 8:30, and we've got lots of great content, so let's get started. First, I'd like to welcome the director of Shore Up Marin City, which is a multiracial environmental coalition that advocates for equitable inclusion of low-income communities in planning and community preparedness. Terry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So I'm Terry Green, the Executive Director of Shore Up Marin City, and I just want to show you some slides just to give some of you all a little background of the community. Many of you all may not be aware. And so right now, let's go to the slides. So Marin City, what you're looking at right now, as for some of you all, you might not know that many folks came from the South. My parents came from the South to work in the shipyards during World War II. And so what happened, the federal government built these little houses for about 6,000 residents. It was the most multicultural community, culturally diverse community that existed here in this county. Again, when we take a look at the factory workers who built the Liberty ships during World War II, they worked around the clock. The workers brought their families to live in Marin City to make a new life in California. Okay. I want you to take a look right now at Marin City. There's a good picture to show you what Marin City looks like. We have about 4,500 residents that live in Marin City at this time. It's right next to the 101 freeway. There's a pond right there, but you can actually see the community. You can see the watershed where water just pours down, water from the bay that comes in. When there's torrential rains, we're in trouble. Flooding exists. What's interesting about it, when you take a look at this picture, Marin City really is a bowl. We have a bowl with no outlet. When the flood waters block the ramps of 101, people can't get in and out of Marin City for medical care, go to school, or go to work. So that's just a little bit of where we are today. So let me talk about Marin City. Folks coming from the South to make the community a better place in which to live. After the war ended, everyone had saved up all of their money. And when we take a look at it, they saved up their money because they wanted to buy homes for their families. But in Marin County, because of laws on the books, laws that said no blacks here, Black folks couldn't move to different places. They couldn't move to Tiburon or Ross or Mill Valley or San Rafael. Folks had to stay right where they are. But what happened? The residents said, you know what, we're gonna make this our home. And that's exactly what they did. There's still laws on the books. Might not be written in pen, but it's written on the minds and hearts of folks today. That's why you don't see Black folks spread throughout Marin County. You see people of color primarily in Marin City or in the canal. Minds and hearts have to be changed. But over time, there's one thing that remains the same, and that's the issue of flooding. You see, sea level rise is real, and flooding has only gotten worse over time. Let's just think about it. Since 1940, that's 80 years. In 20 years, it'll be 100 years that we've been going through this issue of flooding. But you know what? We've gone through the county, we've gone to the county, we've gone to our board of supervisors. We've talked about these challenges that we've been facing time and time again. But it falls on deaf ears. The same structural racism that existed when my parents came to work in the segregated shipyards, the same structural racism exists today. One of the things the whole nation, the whole world is understanding with COVID-19, that it's exposed that these same ills, it's exposed these same inequities. The anger, the grief, and the desperation that we're experiencing in this county right now, it speaks clearly. And I keep talking about this because structural racism is real, but it speaks to the issues of racial inequities. Climate change, sea level rise, is probably the greatest public health threat that we are experiencing right now. And we're going to see an increase in the natural hazards. We're going to see increases in wildfires, in the droughts, in the floodings. We're going to see it. But how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to deal with the fact that when the community of Marin City goes to help make decisions, that boom, folks pretend that we don't exist? How are we going to deal with that? We need your help in dealing with it. Why are we dealing, short Marin City, why are we dealing with the issue of flooding? We're dealing with it because flooding brings a lot of contamination burdens. It also brings loss of jobs. It brings with it loss of essential buildings, essential services. When it floods, our safety building, there's flooding around that. Our schools, there's flooding around that. Our businesses. Most of all, you can't get in or out of Marin City. But when we take a look at our houses, our homes are threatened by it as well. Flooding brings with it respiratory problems. Why? Because of the mold and the mildew. Lots of asthma. Oh, it brings a lot of issues with it that we have to deal with. Why? Why do we have to look at flooding? Because when we take a look at it, Marin City has the highest chronic disease rate in the whole county. Why? Because there is a clear association between the flooding and health in Marin City. I look at our community. I look at the fact that oftentimes in vulnerable communities like ours, they're built right next to contaminated sites. We have an unassessed Superfund site in Marin City, but we also have miles and miles of contaminants that rolls right down the 101 freeway as you come into Marin City. It rolls right, it was designed to come into our community. Why is that? We have to deal with those issues, but we can't deal with them by ourselves. We're gonna need you all to help advocate for us. These issues have to be addressed. Yes, we're working on issues of flood mitigation. Yes, we're looking at the pond, but we're looking at this pond not as an eyesore, but we want to be able to turn it into a beautiful wetland restoration park. We're partnering with Audubon right now, and I'm so glad about that because we're looking at coming up with a design for it to be the pond that we know where it used to have these beautiful birds coming. I mean, it was awesome at one point. Why can't we turn that around and make that a reality again? but we're gonna need your help in doing this. Again, when I talk about structural racism, and I look at the fact that the county, and yes, the county board of supervisors pretend that we don't exist. And again, enough is enough. When I look at the issue of flooding and the fact that no one seems to care about it, and yes, we have a flood study that was not completed, but you know what? It feels, when I think about it now, I get out of breath. Feels very much like what's happening in this country when the knee is on our neck. It feels very much like that. That has to change. We have to be a part of the decision-making body that happens in this county. No more exclusionary decision-making in our system. We have to have inclusion, not exclusion. So what can you do? You can call the Board of Supervisors and say, hey, what's happening down there in Marin City? Folks in Marin City have to be a part of the decision-making that's happening in the built environment. You all can put some pressure. We need you to put some pressure. And I thank you for listening. If you have questions in the end, hey, I'm here to answer your questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Terry. I have to say, I'll probably never look at Marin City quite the same. Thank you. Appreciate that. And, you know, it's a great reminder that so often the issues of climate change and environmental justice are so closely interlinked with racial justice as well. And I'd like to, I loved how you mentioned the challenges, exactly the challenges you guys are facing in Marin City, which is people aren't able to get where they want to go because the streets are flooded, and also the public health hazards. And I just wanted to pause to remind us all, as we look at those photos of flooded streets, that water is really heavy. A cubic yard of seawater weighs 1,728 pounds. And for those of you who think in metric, a cubic meter is 1,026 kilos. And that makes water especially dangerous, damaging, and difficult to manage. So thank you so much for that, Terry. And thank you for offering some suggestions on what people can do. So now I'd like to transition to our next speaker, Dr. Kristina Hill, who is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at UC Berkeley. She studies ways in which we're going to need to change our built environment in response to sea level rise. Today, she's going to be talking about how that's likely to impact Marin and how we need to look out for rising groundwater levels too. Welcome, Kristina.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm going to share my screen. Oh, there I go. Okay. So I want to acknowledge what Terry Green said about what's happening in Marin City, because we've been working with them for the last year, my students and I, grad students and I at UC Berkeley. And the things she talked about are very serious problems, and I'll use it as an example to help explain how sea level rise and groundwater are connected. This is a view, if you don't recognize it, of the off-ramps of Highway 101 in Marin City when you're traveling northbound on Highway 101. And that's king tide. So that's not even a rainy day. That's just king tide starting to block those ramps. I'm sure some of you have seen that. So let me take a long-term perspective, because one of the tasks I have in this talk is to give an overview of what's happening with sea level rise in the Bay Area, what we know now. So I wanted to remind everybody that sea level has been rising really, really slowly for the last 8,000 years or so. And it's during that really slow period that human beings have invented cities and started living in cities. So we've never actually operated cities during a period of rapid sea level rise ever in human history, as far as we know. And if you look at this graph, you can see this rapid phase here called meltwater pulse 1A, another rapid phase here, It's been quite fast in the past, and we think that in the future, it's also going to be fast. And really our choices are bad, terrible, and extremely terrible for what that trend may be, to put it in quite technical language. So we don't know which roller coaster we've on, but we sure have bought the ticket. And we're sitting in the seat, and we're just gonna find out. So unfortunately, we don't know how bad it's going to be, but we know it's likely to be bad. This is what the state of California is telling cities and public agencies. And what they're saying with these numbers, this graph is a version of the table that the state has sent out, is that if you have a very low risk, low cost thing you're building, like a trail on the side of the bay, then you can use the lower numbers, the blue line on this graph, as your assumption about how sea level is rising. If you're building something very expensive and meant to be permanent, something like a highway or a sewage treatment facility, or an urban district, then you should be looking at the red line, the H++ line, because that may be what happens. And we just don't know which roller coaster we're on, but I have to say it's not looking good right now when you look at the emissions data. If we can get down to net zero by 2050, we have a better chance of being on the orange line. But right now, it's not looking good. We're tracking a fairly high projection. So let me go on from that. And just to give people a sense of timing, that could be almost 3 feet of sea level rise by 2050 in only 30 years. So these are significant numbers, and up to as much as 10.2 feet by 2100. Again, if we track that highest projection. So BCDC, the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, has done an excellent report just this spring, March 2020, Adapting to Rising Tides. It's available on their website. And they identify the hot spots for sea level rise impacts around the Bay Area. I'm just going to focus on the Central Bay. And in Marin County, this is all Bayside research. They're showing San Rafael as a very early place that's going to have impacts at only 10, 16 inches of sea level rise, somewhere in the first foot. And also Marin City, for other reasons, is likely to be impacted by the first foot. Of course, both of these places already have flooding. So they're just going to see more and more of that more frequently. One of the things that this study points out is that it's our transportation networks that are especially vulnerable. In addition to actual structures, it's our ability to get around in the Bay Area that's at stake first. And they identify, the BCDC's report identifies 59 miles of highways and bridges exposed to flooding, and 5 million daily vehicle trips. So we showed, Terry showed images of 101 flooding. It's southbound lanes. That's the kind of flooding we're going to see a lot more of on 580, on 101, on 880, and so on. Certainly Highway 37. So we know that one of the first things that's going to happen is that we're going to have a hard time getting around, and traffic is going to be worse, and nobody wants to hear that. And in addition, some people just won't be able to get to their houses, and that's the key thing about Marin City. They actually can't get in and out when they flood. This is a summary of some of the things about sea level rise that many people don't think about. Again, it's from that BCDC study, and it mentions the fact that contamination complicates and exacerbates flooding. That means every place that has a legacy of industrial pollution in the soil, that could be remobilized by both overwash from seawater and from groundwater rising, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And that contaminant can also go into the bay as well as affect people's houses. So we're worried about old landfills, areas where there were old gas stations and dry cleaners. It's quite widely distributed areas that have contamination, surprisingly so. And then displacement issues for low-income members of our communities are likely to be exacerbated, and that we're looking at the need to partner with public agencies because we had to bring in private money and public money to do some of this adaptation. I'm sure there'll be more money questions as we go on during the presentation. And then we'll see pressure on the relationship between recreation and habitat because our wetlands and many of our coastal parks are some of the most vulnerable early properties to sea level rise. So that is kind of the middle of the BCDC report right there. And I think it's the meaty part that we don't always think of first, not just people's houses, but these other components of what's at risk. So now I want to talk about the surprise. Not a happy surprise, but a surprise, where the U.S. Geological Survey and researchers in Hawaii have been leading the conversation about how to understand the effect of sea level rise on groundwater. First, I should say, what is the groundwater that I'm talking about? I'm talking about shallow groundwater that exists near the bay. It's most affected by sea level rise within about a mile of the bay. It's not the deep groundwater that is used for agricultural irrigation. It's shallow groundwater that's often polluted by roadway runoff and other things. It's not seen as a resource, so it's never been mapped. But it lies just below the surface of the soil, between a few inches and maybe 15 feet down around much of the bay edge. The U.S. Geological Survey shows this kind of exaggerated section to explain what's going to happen. They're showing over here rising sea levels and then here a rising water table. I find this kind of exaggerated map really hard to look at and talk about, so I'm going to skip ahead, but I wanted to give you this link and reference so you can see that the USGS is trying to explain this to us also. This is the section that I use to try to explain this, and what it shows is saltwater groundwater over here on the right under the bay. So here's the surface of the bay, and here's the salty groundwater underneath it, and freshwater groundwater filling up all those pore spaces in the soil. And then a typical kind of crust of urban stuff, sewer pipes within about 8 feet of the surface, building foundations and basements if there are any, hazardous materials, like I said, from dry cleaners and gas stations. So that's all in there. And there's also areas like the Marin City Lagoon or canals, like in San Rafael, and levees that are made of earth or concrete seawalls. As the bay water rises, we expect that this salty groundwater is going to push, it's going to create pressure on the freshwater groundwater lens and push it up. And near the bay, it may come up, for every foot of sea level rise, we may see a rise of 1 foot in groundwater within about a half a mile of the bay. So it's going to be a very significant rise, and we're going to discover just how shallow the dry land crust is that we've put all our infrastructure in next to the bay. And the fact that there's a levee here, as you'll notice, doesn't make any difference. It's going to rise anyway because the pressure occurs well below all the compacted materials in that levee. So what are some of the impacts? Soil pollution getting remobilized and going under people's homes so that vapor components penetrate foundations and pipes and come into the living spaces of people's houses. Not good, very bad. Potential for foundations to heave. Potential for liquefaction to be worse, speaking of foundations, where the soil behaves like a liquid when the energy wave of an earthquake comes through it. And then sanitary and sewer pipes, storm sewer pipes, can be flooded by groundwater in regions like ours where a lot of them are cracked at the joints from past seismic activity or from deferred maintenance. So all of this can go wrong before we even see the water at the surface. And that's very important to know that this is happening inch by inch below the land and is starting to cause problems that we're only just beginning to get at. I wanted to show you this block diagram version too, because I think it's easier for some people to visualize. This is showing the freshwater again in the light blue, the seawater underneath it, a sewer pipe sticking out on my block diagram, a levee, a road, a creek bed, and a parking lot that's been used to cap old soil contaminants from, let's say, a gas station. As sea level rises, first the sewer lines get filled. The creek water starts to back up. It starts to have more water in it during the whole year. These underground contaminants can be remobilized out into habitat and affecting people's homes. And then, as it continues to rise, the groundwater actually moves as like water on the surface of the land. It follows topography. So that groundwater is going to accumulate in low places first. And that could be at a creek or a canal. That could be in the lagoon in Marin City. And roadways are often some of the lowest infrastructure elements of our urban areas. They're sort of the stream these days. And it all happens even though there's a levee here. So I really want to emphasize that coastal structures don't stop this from happening. It's coming. For the people who are from West Marin, I wanted to mention that Stinson Beach has a similar problem, and some of my colleagues from the U.S. Geological Survey did this map to show here's where groundwater is today. It's emergent at the lagoon, and it's about 1 or 2 meters or 6-8 feet down in this orange area and shallow in the red. At 1 meter of sea level rise, it's going to be extremely shallow, and the lagoon will be larger because of emergent groundwater. And at 2 meters of sea level rise, all of this will be open water. And that's not even considering the ocean actually coming over the sandbar. So it's going to flood from freshwater groundwater before it floods from saltwater. That's very, very important to know. We made a map of the Bay Area on the internal side, on the bay side, because there was no map. And all these areas that are red are places where the water table today is within about 1 meter of the surface. So 1 meter of sea level rise would turn all those red areas blue. Just to zoom in on a few of them, this one is downtown San Rafael, this one is Corte Madera. All these red areas and black areas are between 0 and 1 meter. The water table is only between 0 and 1 meter below the surface. So that's really concerning. That means that there are increasing liquefaction risks, pipe infiltration, potential contaminants moving, all the things we just talked about. And this is another one of Alviso, East Oakland, much of Oakland, in fact, Sunnyvale and Palo Alto, East Palo Alto. It's a pretty common problem around the Bay Area. I want to talk about Marin City because it's a really good example of what can happen with sea level putting pressure on groundwater levels. This is an image of Marin City from 1931, an aerial image, and it shows that Marin City was entirely a wetland. This is pretty much the location of Drake Avenue up here. Donahue wasn't there, of course, and this is where the highway is pretty much now. So this whole large area here was a wetland. And those wetland soils don't allow a lot of water to pass through. They're clay, so they're going to make it difficult for this area to drain. This is a similar image to the one that Terry showed. All the water in the bowl of Marin City comes to the bottom at the Gateway Mall and at this little pond here, which you drive by on the highway and may or may not even notice. And there's an underground pipe, a culvert, that drains this tidal pond into the bay and lets the tide come up. Also, it's actually two-way flow. And as sea level rises and groundwater rises, we're going to see this pond get bigger and bigger and bigger. And let me show you some map versions of that. I just wanted to show it this way first to say, it's kind of like a bathtub with only one little teeny drain. And we're going to see water coming up into the bottom of the bathtub. And then there'll be nowhere for rainwater to go. This is what we think groundwater would be like emerging at 1 foot of sea level rise. So all these black areas would be open water at just 1 foot of sea level rise. These ramps, certainly the pond would be larger, this ditch here, all of this ramp area would be standing water during the wet season. At 2 feet of sea level rise, it gets larger. All this gray area, the groundwater is within about 3 feet of the surface. So they're going to be starting to see other kinds of problems. So at 2 feet of sea level rise, we see severe impacts where Donahue Street and these ramps are almost permanently wet. And then at 3 feet of sea level rise, an even larger footprint for what's emergent water. And at 6 feet, I'm skipping a lot ahead here, pretty much the lower entire part of Marin City is flooded. So that's really important, obviously for Marin City. But when you look at the sea level rise viewers, this is an excellent one that BCDC has developed, which I think Katharyn Boer is also going to show a little bit about in a few minutes. But it doesn't show any flooding in Marin City at 36 inches of sea level rise. And that's because this viewer doesn't include groundwater. There's a new version of it coming. I'm helping people. We applied for a grant. We got it. It's going to happen soon. But it may take a couple of years before those maps are available. And boy, are people going to be surprised when they see how much more flooding is likely to happen as sea level rises and groundwater also comes up. So this is just half of the story, and that's why it shows Marin City dry. It doesn't include groundwater. This is me out there with some of the interns from Marin City. We've been talking a lot about flooding, and this is king tide flooding in Marin City. They've been learning about how to talk about groundwater and how to talk to public officials about why Marin City needs help so soon, even though the BCDC maps as they exist today don't show that. And we've been looking at infrastructure maps. Here's the 2 lanes of highway, well, 2 sections of Highway 101 and the off-ramps just represented by these skinny lines. These blue lines show drain pipes underground. And you can see, just looking at this map, that the drain pipes on this side, on the Sausalito side, are separate from the drain pipes on the Marin City side. They're almost segregated. It's a kind of segregated stormwater system. And there's no storm drain where Donahue goes underneath the Highway 101 overpass. Normally there would be, but there isn't. I can't tell you why it wasn't built, but there isn't one. And that's why Marin City is such an isolated bathtub when it comes to flooding, and why its system has no emergency overflow. So we've been talking about what could be done in a place like Marin City where it functions like this big bathtub. And we've talked about putting temporary mobile pumps over here by Donahue that would drain out into Sausalito and the Bay system over here. This is the existing drain under Highway 101. And this is the pond itself that we were talking about earlier. And we're thinking about how there could be a community park here, not only so that people can just go out and have a picnic, but so they can see what's happening. They can see the bay from this vantage point on the northern side of the pond, and they can see the pond. So it would allow all the people who live in this area to see what's changing as it happens. And I think that lets human beings really use their native intelligence when we can see what's happening. So that seems like a critical opportunity to me, to put a park in here and be able to see what's changing as the water levels come up. The next step would be to think about a future second drain, and the county is talking about that, but hasn't really put any money to it. They're hoping for a FEMA grant that, as far as we know, has not come through. Been waiting years for that to come through. So something has to happen. In the meantime, this may eventually happen to basically be the second drain on the bathtub. And then someday this Gateway Mall site is either going to be a floating city or a wetland. And that's a wonderful opportunity to think about nature-based adaptation. Might mean that there would be commercial along Donahue, but not in this big area here. So everything in the flats next to the bay is going to be under similar pressure, but it's especially bad in Marin City. I'm just going to say it one more time, because it's like a bathtub, it's like a bowl, and the water can't get out. Where in Tam Valley, the water will drain down to the creeks. In Marin City, there's no such drain. So it's going to back up. And I wanted to leave you with the thought, we have been helping interns and residents in Marin City. These are a couple folks from Marin City. There's Terry, Shamaka Green, Sonia Sones. We've been helping them think about how to give public testimony on technical subjects and what maps to show and how to talk about it. And these are my students pretending to be the District 3 Flood Board. So there they are. The student is from China, the student is from Berkeley. This is Sandy from the Short Marin City team. I just wanted to leave the thought with everybody on this call that you can make a difference by telling your county supervisor, especially District 3, that you support making investments in Marin City. It's unincorporated, and the only way it's going to get attention is if people with resources cause that attention to be directed to it. That's how it works. We all need to get our elected officials to look, pay attention, and give them praise when they decide to make investments in places like Marin City and in the San Rafael Canal District first, because those are the places that are going to suffer the most. And the rest of us will have more options. We don't typically live in bowls. So this is a really challenging set of circumstances, and it's going to take all of us pointing to it to really draw people's attention to it. And I'll try to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that's great information. Again, thank you so much for telling us for your expertise in this, and also for explaining more about what Terry was talking about the unique challenges, well, unique, but more Marin is likely to be facing similar challenges faced by Marin City right now. And I appreciate your call to action as well, because like I say, at EFM, we're about education as well, education and action. And I really appreciated also your pointing out that it doesn't necessarily matter where your individual house is, because if you rely on the freeways, if you rely on public infrastructure, you will be impacted by sea level rise and groundwater rise, which is fascinating. Haven't heard much about that at all, but clearly it's going to be a big issue in Marin. And so I wanted to let everybody know, Kristina and Kathy, who's coming up, are both going to be referring to this online tool from VCDC, which is called the Bay Area Bay Area Flood Explorer. So if you're wondering, is your workplace in a low-lying part of Marin? How likely is it to be impacted, and where? All those things. You could actually check that out on the BCDC modeler, because that will show you sea level rise street by street. So I'm sure we'll send you a link afterwards so that you can check it out and do some exploring on your own, but do not go there now. Personally, I'd be like, oh, really? I want to see how my house is doing. No, because what that calculator is not going to show you is what we can do about it. And that's what our next speaker is going to be talking about. So I would like to welcome Dr. Katharyn Boyer. She is professor of biology at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center at San Francisco State University. And this evening, she will be telling us about nature-based adaptations that we can put in place in San Francisco Bay and Marin County. Over to you, Kathy.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen and go to presenter view. Does it look good? No, didn't go. How about now?
All good.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm a professor of biology at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center at San Francisco State University. And get organized here. Get rid of this little screen. So it's my pleasure to speak with you about sea level rise adaptation, and particularly about how we can partner with nature to help protect our shores while also maintaining wildlife habitat. So like I said, I'm at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, and this is in Tiburon, in the Tiburon Peninsula in Marin County. Maybe some of you have visited when we've had Discovery Day or a book club or a public forum, and if you haven't, I certainly hope you will. So my students, technicians, and I study ecology and restoration in the shallow reaches of San Francisco Bay. And our work has turned more and more to how we can use ecological restoration in adaptation to various climate changes as their impacts are starting to be felt. So of course, we're talking about one of those climate changes today, in particular, sea level rise. And as you know, climate warming is leading to water levels rising in the oceans from melting of ice and also thermal expansion of water. And as Kristina already mentioned, we could be expecting about a foot of sea level rise by 2030, maybe 3 feet by 2050, maybe 10 feet by 2100, so quite a bit. And we can visualize a foot of sea level rise right now just by heading out during a king tide. Kristina also mentioned this, but king tides are the highest tides of the year. If you didn't know that, they're near the winter and summer solstices. And so if you go out during a winter king tide, especially after a storm, you'll see even higher water levels. It's important to understand that there's the water level at the high tide that we need to be thinking about, also that added sea level rise, but also the storm surge. And by storm surge, we mean the buildup of water from storms. And although storm surge is temporary, it adds to the overall flooding that we see. Look good still? Just want to make sure I haven't lost it. Yeah, okay. So we've been talking about the Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer, and I won't belabor this too much because you've seen it a little bit already. But if we enter, if we zoom in on a particular area of interest and we enter 12 inches of sea level rise, I think it's really interesting to look at this portion over here, which shows, that sea level, 0 sea level rise and a king tide will give you the same thing, 12 inches of sea level rise. And again, we're not talking about groundwater being part of this model at this point. If we look at 48 inches of sea level rise, you can take a look at this and see what that would be equivalent to. So let's say it was 36 inches of sea level rise along with the king tide, or let's say it was 18 inches of sea level rise along with a 25-year storm. So thinking about the total flooding, you have to take a look at all of the different portions of flooding that contribute to that. So with coastal flooding, we'll see greater inundation of low-lying areas, and in Marin, and as in other parts of the world, the lowest lying areas often contain socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. And so, for example, with even 1 foot of sea level rise, the canal community in central San Rafael is highly vulnerable. And these higher water levels will also make shoreline erosion worse. So we're seeing up to 6 feet per year eroding away at the Corte Madera Marsh, the Corte Madera Ecological Reserve. This is showing you Muzzy Marsh. And over time, we've seen quite a lot of erosion. So marshes provide a spectacular coastal defense by buffering the energy of waves, but we need to keep them in place in order for them to perform that service, or we could restore them if we want to get that service back. So faced with these assaults on our shorelines from sea level rise and erosion, our knee-jerk reaction is to put up armor in defense. And we've been doing this for many decades or even centuries in some places. So these types of structures create a hard boundary between the land and the sea that's fixed in place. And they have almost no wildlife value. They're not resilient or adaptive, and they can be expensive. So these traditional gray solutions are in stark contrast to what we call living shorelines. So these are strategically designed shoreline restoration treatments that enhance natural habitats while also protecting shores. These provide connections between the land and the sea instead of cutting them off, and allow for an upward shift of habitats as sea level rises. They reduce the power of waves by absorbing their energy. They're dynamic and adaptable over time, and they're typically less expensive than traditional gray solutions. So we can think of living shorelines being on this continuum from these sort of green, softer techniques to these gray, harder techniques. As we get more wave energy, we might be thinking about some kind of a hybrid between vegetation, more green kind of technique and the harder structure. So a sort of a green-gray hybrid. And there's going to be situations where only a seawall is going to work, where the wave energy is really high, or we have working waterfronts. We might still need those seawalls. But there are ways to add habitat features to those as well, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So with living shorelines, we attempt to mimic nature's defenses using natural processes to protect and build shoreline resiliency. And in our local bays and estuaries, and our natural toolbox includes a number of species that form habitat along our shores. So these species can help to absorb wave energy and trap sediments and work with natural processes. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the different kinds of nature-based adaptation that are being piloted and experimented with in the Bay Area. And so these are oyster reefs and eelgrass, bay beaches, thin layer placement, and as I said, I'll talk a little bit about living seawalls and how we can actually put habitat into those as well. So first, oyster reefs and eelgrass beds. The first living shorelines projects in San Francisco Bay and actually throughout California have involved these native oysters and native eelgrass. So we're talking about the Olympia oyster, and that's Ostrea lorida, and eelgrass Ostrea marina. So these are native species that are diminished in San Francisco Bay and the focus of restoration projects. They're both considered foundational species, and that means that through their presence, there's living space for lots of other species that attach to or live among that added complexity that they bring. So to restore native oysters, we need to provide a hard surface for their larvae out in the open bay water to settle on. And we've had good success by providing either waste oyster shell from the shucking operation or structures made from what we call baycrete. And this is a concrete that's made from 20% cement and 80% sand. and also shell from the bay, and it can be formed into a wide variety of shapes, as you can see here. For eelgrass, we collect it from natural beds, and we use one or more different anchoring techniques. Here I'm showing you this technique we use with bamboo stakes, where we attach the eelgrass, and those anchors hold the plants in place until they root. And we now have 2 living shorelines projects in San Francisco Bay, where we have restored oyster reefs and eelgrass, both alone and together, at a scale large enough to not only assess habitat value, but also physical effects. So these projects are managed by the State Coastal Conservancy, and they involve a large group of project partners. So the first of those has been underway for over 5 years, and some of the results of that have come out in a book on living shorelines. We have a chapter in there if you're interested in reading more about some of the early results, and also about other projects throughout the US on living shorelines type techniques. But just to give you a sense of some of the things that we found. Lots of habitat. So we and our project partners have seen millions of oysters established in just a few months on oyster reefs that we've added. And uncommon species show up, like the black oyster catcher and the bay pipefish. We've seen economically important species show up, like the Dungeness crab. And with all these species, lots of small invertebrates, small fish, we see increased foraging opportunity for birds. So this has been quite a boon for habitat by providing these kinds of features. We've also seen about a 30% reduction in wave energy across the reefs. So as the waves, you can see kind of white caps in this Google Earth image as they kind of come toward the reef. They get much reduced as they cross through the reef structure itself. And it looks something like this. Watch as the wave hits that and dissipates. And if we plant eelgrass on the shore side of that, we see greater spread of the plants with about 3 times more shoots compared to when it's planted on the bay side. And boosting eelgrass growth could have other climate-related benefits, including increased uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. It can also locally increase the pH of water that's becoming increasingly more acidic. And this in turn could have positive effects on oysters that have trouble forming shells in acidified waters. And all these are things that my lab and others at the EOS Center are working to quantify right now. Next is bay beaches. So this is coarse sediment, sand and gravel, shell beaches. These are common historic features in San Francisco Bay. And there's still examples that you can see if you know where to look. So these beaches protect the marshes behind them, and they build elevation over time. And we can proactively add a coarse sediment beach at the base of a marsh and simulate a natural wave-built berm to help protect the marsh behind, whether this is a natural marsh or a marsh that we've restored. And if we maintain the marsh, the levee height behind it might need to be a little less tall and still protect the infrastructure, because the beach and the marsh absorb much of that wave energy. So it might be 50% less height that's necessary to hold that water back. And so conceptual designs are underway for coarse sediment placement at several places around the bay at this point, including an eroding beach at Blackie's Pasture in Tiburon and at Muzzy Marsh in Corte Madera. In addition, at Tiscornia Marsh. So I mentioned earlier this canal community here. You can see the edge of Tiscornia Marsh in 1987 and where the edge of the marsh is today. Looking a little closer at that, this is a schematic showing that the existing conditions of the marsh. And a design that's being considered is to add a coarse beach out here that would help to protect a marsh behind it, and then in turn protect the community behind that. And I think we'll see more projects like this as there's greater recognition that we can bring back this type of feature to protect marshes and the land behind them. There's a brand new report that just came out from SFEI and partners, everything that you'd need to know about bay beaches. It's called New Life for Eroding Shorelines, and there's a web page here that you can take a look at, and additional work from this project will be posted on this web page as well. So in combination with those beaches, we're testing a technique we're calling arboring. And this involves trying to grow plants that have a natural propensity to climb anyway, like pickleweed. It's a common marsh plant, Salicornia pacifica, and also a really rare plant, the California sea blight, Sueda californica, will also do this climbing. And so the idea is that we add these branches, they could be eucalyptus, waste eucalyptus branches from landscaping, put them into the marsh and allow the plant to climb up and increase the canopy of the plants as they climb. And this is important because wildlife, including endangered species like the California ridgeways rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse, need to get up out of the water, even just on high tides today, and still have a way to hide from predators. And this will become more of an issue as sea level rises. You can see the rail exposed here along a bike path with nowhere to go on a high tide, and over here a vole swimming away from marsh plants that are going underwater. Here my San Francisco State Wetlands Ecology class is installing arbors, and they're also planting the endangered California sea blight, in this case at Point Pinole. We're also doing this in Marin at Blackie's Pasture in Tiburon. And Kelly Santos is one of my graduate students who's looking at the role of this arboring and whether it can get the plants to grow taller. And I think you might be able to see here that the plants are growing a little bit taller with the arbor than without. So we have some good early results suggesting that that is the case, that the arbors do help this plant to grow better, and that should help to also reintroduce this plant, being a very rare species. Thin layer placement. So this is another way to maintain marshes and their shoreline protection functions into the future. This is the application of bay mud onto the surface of a marsh. So this is a technique to raise the surface of the marsh and help it keep pace with sea level rise. And these are photos from a Southern California project. But we have a project in Marin going on right now. The San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve is working on. This is at the Manzanita Marsh. So these kinds of pilot experiments are needed before larger projects move forward. And this is in part because we don't really know how the marsh will respond. Laura Hollander is one of my graduate students, and she's working on understanding how different plant species respond to being buried by sediment, and also looking to see whether it matters if there's a diverse community of marsh species present to the response of the plant community. And then finally, I told you I'd talk a little bit about living seawalls. So when only gray will do, and we're gonna have a seawall, there's still lots of opportunity for green conditions to be created on those seawalls. So you can see crabs and all kinds of invertebrates attaching into these nooks and crannies that have been added on the seawall, a little fish. And there's ongoing experiments to test different shapes and degrees of surface complexity to try to understand how important that is to the habitat value that we can add. Another kind of seawall retrofit is an artificial tide pool. And so this would stay wet after the tide drops down, and allows an intertidal habitat to occur much higher in elevation than it otherwise would. And early results of these kinds of things suggest that there's an increase in diversity and variety of species, largely from things like crabs and fish that can stay wet after the tide goes down. And I just wanted to mention there's a brand new project that's kicking off in Marin this summer. It's called the Reef Design Innovations for Living Shorelines and Seawalls project. It's part of the Advancing Nature-Based Adaptation Solutions in Marin County grant program. This is a Marin Community Foundation and State Coastal Conservancy grant program. And this is a collaboration with my lab and with the Smithsonian and the Studio for Urban Projects. And you can see some of these iterations of different kinds of shoreline and seawall structures that we may come up with that would be specific to the conditions and the species that we have in San Francisco Bay. So I've told you about a variety of different kinds of projects that are going on within the area right now. And this is an interesting map showing how few projects there are even anywhere on the West Coast compared to the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. And it's not surprising really, because these are places that are vulnerable to hurricanes. So they've been developing these kinds of methodologies for decades. But there is a lot of guidance that comes from those other regions. There's something called the Living Shorelines Academy, where you can learn all about living shorelines. There's a community of practice. It's an online group There's technology transfer workshops for contractors and suppliers and nonprofits and researchers and government agencies. There's lots of resources out there. And the key for us is to be able to apply these resources specifically to the species and conditions that we have here. So there's lots to do, and there are ways of going about it, and we're learning as we go. We will need resources for this. I'm sure heard of Measure AA, and hopefully voted for it. It made available $500 million for the Bay. And this was a measure that all 9 Bay Area counties voted for. And it's a parcel tax that applies to every parcel within those counties. And it will go toward wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation. So our momentum for these kinds of projects is building, and we need community input. Let's be sure that we get some of these resources, a lot of these resources, to local community groups so that they can contribute to decisions on what future shorelines should look like. And groups that represent underserved communities especially need support and to be engaged. We need to train scientists and engineers and builders, so the marine contractors who can actually make these projects come to life. We really lack actually the capacity to get a lot of these projects done at the scale that we need to in the region. And the Bay Area is known for innovative ideas, and our challenge now is to develop and test and quickly scale up these kinds of projects as sea level rapidly rises. And again, all the while considering the unique suite of species and conditions that occur locally, and also taking an experimental approach that helps us to learn as we go. So I'll end there and just thank a whole lot of collaborators on all of these different projects. And I think we'll be going to questions.
Well, thank you so much for that, Kathy. It was fascinating to see that there are so many approaches that could be tried and have been tested in smaller scale deployments, and also just fascinating to see this as potentially a big area of economic and of opportunity and growth for people to train to be implementing these solutions. And as you say, we've got to do a lot in a little amount of time to make a difference. So that's great. Now, I've been seeing in the chat that many people have had trouble viewing your slides. So I just want to let people know that there will be a recording of the webinar available on the EFM website. We'll be putting that up within a day or so. And so if you missed the pictures, and they were really good pictures, do go check those out, because it's hard to picture some of the things that Kathy was talking about. Well, Kathy, many of us saw it, some of us didn't. Technology, right? We're still working through the glitches of this webinar format. We wanted also to ask some poll questions. Tamala, did you manage to get those up? Or is this another technology thing? Yeah, many people in the chat are saying, Kathy, that they saw your slides just fine. Oh, so here's a poll. Perhaps you could all take a moment to answer those questions. The first is, do you live or work in a low-lying area of Marin County? Yes, no, or I don't know. And then second, are you familiar with the strategy of managed retreat from shore areas to provide space for nature-based adaptations? Yes, no, or I do not understand what managed retreat would mean in Marin County. I'm going to go with I don't understand, but let's take a moment to see if we can start getting those results in. And meanwhile, I just wanted to mention again the BCDC website, which is great for figuring out if you live or work in a low-lying area of Marin County. As Kristina so eloquently pointed out, in some ways it doesn't matter, because if you're totally isolated from everywhere else in your house, the fact that your house is above sea level is maybe not so useful. But it is interesting to be able to work with those online calculators and start to get a sense of how severely Marin is going to be impacted and which parts of it, at which times in, as far as we can tell with the projections at hand. So Tamala, can you show a quick picture of that BCDC calculator for us? We will be also, so you see there's a bar at the left where you can slide it up to see how the picture changes with different levels of sea level rise. So when you get a chance, you might want to give that a try at home. And again, that's a link that we're going to be sending to you after the event so that you have a chance to do some exploring. Oh, you're going to take it down. Here we go. I don't think it's all live yet because I think we should be seeing a change, and I'm not seeing a change yet.
I think I may have to zoom in.
Maybe we have to zoom in a little more so that we can actually see the, yeah, can you focus on Sandra Fell? Pull that up a little bit. Thank you. And then let's raise the sea level and see what happens. Oh, yeah. So on your own, you can zoom in, you can literally see street by street, and it's really interesting and very sobering. So the second, as I said, we will be including a link to that in our follow-up. And the second poll question was about this concept of managed retreat. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Stuart Siegel, who will be moderating the question and answer session with our panelists. Stuart is the Coastal Resilience Specialist at San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Stuart, thank you for joining us tonight and for leading the Q&A. If you could start off perhaps that second poll question, because I think probably many people in our audience are unfamiliar with the term managed retreat. So perhaps you could start off by asking our panelists to help explain that term. Stuart, can you hear me?
Q&A bar, and that's great. I've been keeping track of them, and we'll get to them as many as we can. I'm gonna, I am going to turn my video off because my internet seems to be unstable, as always happens. So I guess the idea of what is managed retreat, that maybe I can pose that question first to Dr. Boyer, and then ask both Ms. Green and Dr. Hill if they have anything they'd like to add to that.
Sure. Well, managed retreat is simply determining that we should actually take our infrastructure and move it back because sea level rise is coming and it's already happening, and that we need to account for that and stop trying to defend against it, just to move with it. That's the basic concept as I understand it.
Maybe I could add, in the UK, they're now using the term realignment, coastal realignment, because retreat is an unpleasant word for a lot of people. But it means the same thing.
And I have heard of a city on the east coast of England that the government decided to discontinue any shoreline protection measures permanently. They decided it was just too costly for that particular location, and just let things slowly erode and disappear away. And Terry, is there anything you want to add about the idea of retreat that might be relevant to Marin City or other areas?
We've been looking at various designs, and when we're talking about the need to deal with the flooding that's being projected, there were some designs we looked at in terms of moving things back from the shopping center. And so it's something to look at. It's really something to look at. Okay. We have to have more study on that.
Thank you.
But if it caused housing displacement, that would be a bad kind of retreat, especially for low-income folks who have nowhere else to go.
That is one of the challenges. And Kristina, would you like me to get to the various questions that have come in so far? And I see that 3 more just came in.
Please do.
Yeah, I'm going to try to, I'm aim to do is toss them around amongst the 3 presenters tonight, and I'll probably skip around here a little bit. And let me start with Terry. One of the questions came in is if you could explain why the pond is important and how addressing it will help flooding in Marin City.
Sure. It's important for a number of reasons. Number one, it's supposed to hold the water in so we don't have the flooding. But what we found in the flood study of October 2017, that When we even look at the floodgate that it's not working, look at the fact that the pipe itself is too small to hold the water. That's why the county now is looking at maybe a 4 to 8 foot pipe that would actually go from the pond out to the bay. When we take a look at the fact that when, again, these king tides, is torrential raining, and we're talking about flooding to the point of folks not being able to get in and out of Marin City, that's important. We had, it was just last spring, we had a severe, we had flooding to the point of, I think it was Channel 5, that came in and said, oh my goodness, would you look at this? Well, what happens when folks can't get in and out of Marin City? What happens when our kids can't get back from school? What happens when our kids have to walk through all the waters that's polluted? We know it's pollution there to get in. What happens when you're on the bus for hours trying to get in? Causes all kind of stress. But when you also look at the fact, again, when you have a community that has the highest chronic disease rate, our folks depend on being able to go to the medical facilities to deal with their health. And when you can't go, that causes all kind of anxieties. When you take a look, I mean, so it's important for us to take a look at this.
Let me toss a question to to Dr. Hill. I've got several here. I'm going to try to decide which one to start off with here. And I guess the very specific to Marin City then was this question: if there is no levee or structure or 101 or east, or is there something that could be used to address groundwater subsurface? And there was a similar question in that maybe I could lump them together on the concept of might a living seawall be an effective approach to deal with groundwater? Maybe we could lump those two together.
So the question really is, what are some of the strategies for dealing with the high groundwater problem?
Yeah.
A living seawall or a dead seawall is not going to keep out the groundwater because that's on the land side and the pressure is coming up from below. So no matter what structure you spend money on at the coastline itself, it's not going to keep the groundwater from rising as far as we know. The strategies for managing a high water table, the classic traditional strategy is to pump. And the Dutch have been doing that for 1,000 years. New Orleans has been doing it for 150. And it gets you in trouble because the land typically sinks when you pump. So you end up at lower elevation after you pump. So the other alternative is to use your cut and fill to dig artificial ponds and raise mounds and ridges, or dig artificial canals and raise mounds and ridges so that you can wick away the groundwater using canals, or live on top of it in artificial lagoons and ponds. And my Dutch colleagues are working very hard on entire floating urban blocks. And I have a colleague here in the Bay Area who's got a design for that San Jose has permitted. And he's just waiting for a developer as a partner. The developers are all nervous about doing something new. So they're going to have to kind of corral the money and direct it towards making some innovations by making rules that make it too hard to develop in a conventional way. So I think we'll see some innovative ways to live with a high water table, but before those get built, we'll probably see canals or the conversion of leaky underground pipes into pumpable pipe networks, like perforated pipe, not on purpose, but by accident, they've been perforated by cracks. And we might be able to put pumps on those and be able to wick water out of the soil very, very carefully so we don't get subsidence, because that's the problem.
Great, thanks so much. Let me toss a question here to Dr. Boyer. And I guess there's some around costs, and then two questions that are kind of different but similar idea. So let me tackle those two. So one of them is how much do oyster reefs reduce wave attack at high storm surges that do most of the damage? And then I guess in conjunction with that is, if you have 3 feet of sea level rise, how would those living shorelines be effective other than lowering wave energy? Maybe those two kind of fit together to a degree.
Yeah, so the idea is that it could be oyster reefs or you know, some of the other things that I talked about that do dissipate the wave energy. They reduce the height of the waves and the, you know, the ferocity of the waves, if you will. And so, yes, if you have 10 feet of sea level rise, you are ultimately going to need to retreat or allow for these habitats that we're talking about to actually move upslope. And there are places around San Francisco Bay and other places where there is that opportunity, and we can actively plan for that. And there's other places where there is not that room. And it's we will have what we call coastal squeeze, where we have the human infrastructure right up to where, you know, these habitats that we're trying to maintain are eventually going to run out of space for. So we are definitely looking at living shorelines as one tool in the toolbox, and that they're not going to work everywhere, but they certainly will help, and they'll help us to maintain some of these places that we value in terms of their wildlife habitat in the meantime. I think that answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Boyer. Let me look at these interesting set of questions here. Let's see. I guess one question has to do with that's come up in various ways. This idea of managed retreat has come up by Resilient by Design, and trying to deal with the issue of equity that has already come up here. And I guess let's go to all 3 panelists. Is any suggestions or comments you have on how to tackle higher levels of sea level rise and their effects in places that are underrepresented communities, disadvantaged communities such as Marin City or the Canal, without really, you know, can it be done without forcing displacement? Are there ideas any of you have to, especially when you get to 2 or 3 or 4 to sea level rise where things are more costly to address, to comment on that?
You know, one of the things, and I'm sure Dr. Hill will talk about it a little bit more, we've been talking about is the opportunity to really take a look, again, Marin City as a bathtub, and she keeps saying all the time, it's a bathtub without a plug. But what if we really took a look at having a drain that goes up under the 101 freeway out to Sausalito and out to the bay? What if we really took a look at that? Because then when all of the water that's pouring down from the watershed, it would have somewhere to go. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm wondering when they designed Marin City, why didn't they think about that? Because the water floods down and it just literally has nowhere to go. So, you know, that's an option versus having to look at the issues of displacement. The other thing is when you take a look at the Resilient by Design, some of their recommendations, it was mostly around displacement. So we had some real concerns about that. Because with the different things that's happening in different parts of the world, surely we could come up with ways to be able to deal with flooding issues without having to force folks out of the community.
I think that's a really good point, Terry, and I would second that people should be able to stay where they are as long as possible. And we'll have to think about our transitions as phased, that when people, you know, reach a certain stage in their lives when they're ready to move to a smaller place, their kids have gone to college, that's an important phase moment to think about transitioning where you live. There's another phase moment when you could go to a retirement community or to assisted living. And those are important moments to have planned ahead, like in a kind of legacy process, but also with renters, thinking about where they need to be and how they can stay there as long as possible. So I hope as we think about replumbing coastal communities, their drains, their exposure to storms and waves, we'll start to think about neighborhoods and groups of people and where they might want to go at some point over the next 10, 20, 30 years. It's kind of like looking at a train schedule. You're trying to figure out when are you wanting to change stations on that train. It's not going to happen to everybody all at once. And we'll have to figure out transitional strategies because a lot of this is going to have huge impacts. So the more we think about it now, the more prepared we'll be as all of this accelerates.
Yeah, and I would add that there's certainly lots of ideas for, raising up buildings, allowing lower levels to be flooded or to be, to be flexible, to be spaces that are used, say, for parking. And then if there's flooding, we know that, there's, storm type flooding that's coming, that's going to add on to sea level rise, that sort of thing. And we can expect that to come, then, then you can move your cars out of the garage, sort of thing. None of these are great solutions, but there's certainly lots of ideas that are floating around, including in the Resilient by Design process, to think about how communities can stay where they are by elevating and having other kinds of ways of sort of getting out of harm's way, but without actually leaving.
Right. And unfortunately, we don't have an endless amount of dirt to raise everything with. So we have to start thinking about how to cut as well as fill. And canals are a really good strategy, I think, for staying in place as long as possible without having to find fill by using cut. And then eventually artificial excavated ponds that we can float whole neighborhoods on in a good density kind of way, where it'd be 3-story floating units, which has already happened in Amsterdam. So some of these things sound like science fiction, but you can go to Netherlands today and see how they work and kick the tires. It's pretty amazing. There's no reason why this area can't do more floating in a kind of honeycomb of artificial ponds at the edge and find that a beautiful way to live. But we will have to build new housing. And every time I'm on one of these conversations with people in Marin, I feel like I should say that. You're going to have to build new housing and at higher densities to be able to live in the space that's left over without then encroaching on areas that have a high fire risk or could cause landslides. So there will have to be new housing at higher densities at some point, or you'll just have fewer people.
Thanks. I have to say I'm impressed by the number of questions coming in from people here. Very engaged audiences. Quite wonderful to see. Let me jump to some questions that pertain to Dr. Hill. And so I think there's some of these questions and chats coming in around the concept of how significant the groundwater issue might be, how far inland it goes, what does it do to the infrastructure? And so you sort of described as this hidden threat from below. And I think people are trying to, I get the impression of a couple of questions here, trying to really understand and digest that a bit more. Maybe you could just elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody has a basement. I have a basement. I'm in Berkeley. And every winter I see water come up through the cracks in the floor. That's groundwater. And when the rainy season comes, that water in the soil rises. And if I was a little closer to the bay, I'm probably a mile from the bay edge. If I were a little closer, I'd even be able to see the tides come up in my basement. And that's what's happening in a lot of coastal areas. Even if we don't have basements, it's happening in our sewer pipes. It's happening in conduit that carries electrical pipes. We're starting to see water penetrating. We're going to see some trees dying, plants changing as groundwater levels change over time. And most freshwater comes from rain. Groundwater comes from rain. So if we have a drought for a number of years, then the freshwater lens and the groundwater will be thinner. But some people think that those are the years in which the saltwater lens will come up higher. So we don't know enough yet. What we need is a lot of monitoring to be able to figure this out. And citizen science would be great in this area if anyone has old wells or sumps on their property to share data about what you're seeing. So we'll see sewer lines for storm sewers and sewer lines for sanitary sewers fill up. That's the first effect. Then we'll start to see electrical conduits be affected if you have underground electrical. Then we'll start to see pressure on foundations for bridges and for buildings start to be under some pressure to heave. And then we'll start to see emerging water. And we'll see areas get spot flooding where the stormwater used to go into the pipe and now it can't because the pipe's already full. So we're already seeing that around the Bay Area. And we'll even see groundwater bubbling up through manholes. Already see that in Alameda and in East Oakland. So it's coming. I bet it exists in Marin City and I just don't know the particular spot.
Oh yeah, definitely exists. You can see it in the shopping center during the rainy season. Water's always bubbling up. Yeah. It's
driven by how much rain you've had and where the tides are, how high they are. And then at king tide, of course, it'll be the highest. If it's wet and raining at king tide, you'll see groundwater very high. And it extends, we think the effect of the tides extends at least a half a mile in from the Bay Shore. And it may be farther. The USGS did a study of New Haven, Connecticut, and they predict that sea level rise is going to have an impact on groundwater elevations as much as 3 miles inland. And of course, that has to be a flat landscape to see that become emergent surface water flooding. But that's a serious halo around the edge of the ocean that no one has incorporated yet into any of the maps that we've seen in the US or in the region or internationally. No one has this yet in their maps.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to shift gears a tiny bit. There's been a number of questions about how to cost estimates to do the living shorelines. What you think they cost, and then where might the money come from, and then that we'll broaden it some from there because there's some related questions. But let me start there.
Sorry, Stuart, could you repeat, because you froze for the beginning of that.
I'll keep my video off to keep my internet better there. So there's a number of questions around costs of adaptation, and some have to do with what the living shoreline projects cost and maybe some of the habitat levy kinds of things, and where the funds might come from for that. And then I'll kind of take it from there. There's some other related questions. Maybe you can start with that.
Okay. Well, most of the living shorelines projects locally, and there aren't very many of them yet, have come from bond funding, are coming from Measure AA funding through the Restoration Authority. They've come from a lot of them have come through the Coastal Conservancy and partners who have contributed funds to those projects, and they're largely experimental pilot projects at this point. They're not at a scale at all where they could actually protect a shoreline or an extended stretch of shoreline. So this is why I'm saying that if we want to have these kinds of habitats that also can provide some shoreline protection, then we need to be able to scale them up. And that means we need to understand how they work sooner than later so that we can have the information necessary to make those decisions of should we scale them up to large areas. So there have been quite a few cost comparisons now that have been done on East Coast and Gulf Coast living shorelines projects. You know, there are a number of published papers, and there's gray literature, there's reports that do those cost comparisons. And it really depends on what the living shoreline includes, what it's going to cost. So if there's hard infrastructure as part of that living shoreline, if it's like a gray-green kind of thing, then there's the cost of actually building that structure and putting it in place, as you would have with a traditional engineered structure to some extent. And I'm not going to give you numbers because these projects that we have now are, they are largely to get these pilot projects in place, and a large portion of the cost of them at this point is to try to is the understanding of how they work. It's the monitoring And it's the 5 years that we hope to get on a project to understand what its functions are over that period of time. So I guess I've kind of avoided the question to some degree, but you know, that's kind of where we are in the Bay Area. We're not to the point of being efficient with these projects yet, where I could say it costs this compared to say, you know, some kind of a bulkhead or some kind of riprap shoreline. You know, we would be able to compare those directly if we get to that point, and I hope we do soon, where we can make those kinds of cost comparisons, because for one thing, we'll have the capacity to build these things locally. I will say a project that we put in at Giant Marsh at Point Pinole in the last year, you know, it was difficult to find contractors who actually could do that kind of work in the shallow parts of the bay. We had to bring people, a contractor in from Washington who had the equipment that was able to do this. And you know, so we need to get to the point where we have the capacity in all sorts of ways to actually construct these projects on a larger scale. And then we'll be able to say, well, this is what they cost.
Well, you know, one of the things that I think we need to get a little bit more creative, because there are other funding sources out there. But when I think about Marin County, one of the things we might want to take a look at, and at least this is what we're thinking about in Marin City, is asking the Board of Supervisors, asking the county actually to do an equity audit. Because we want to see where has the funding gone over the last 10, 20 years. And then that might determine where money should go. The other thing is we have to really begin to think about, hey, where are those areas that have been neglected, especially in Marin County, that where some attention needs to be paid, and make a conscious decision that, you know what, we're going to give a high priority to those areas, and we're going to work together to find the money, because the money is out there. But it has to be a conscious decision made that, you know what, let's deal with it. So Marin City, I know, has been neglected for years. We have an opportunity to look at it as a model and make these changes. Do something that's just fantastic. Do this drain, take the pond or the lagoon, turn it into a beautiful habitat. Whatever we need to do, let's do it together. But it has to be a conscious decision that the way we've been doing things have not worked. We've been really being discriminatory in our funding. Let's be equitable and let's get the job done. And we can do this. I believe we could do it.
Thanks so much, Ms. Green. That was really nice. I was about to jump to you and ask you that exact question as a follow-on there. And I don't know if maybe Dr. Hill, you can comment, because you've looked at different, not just Bay Area and California, but broader as to kinds of funding mechanisms that people have been employing and nationally or internationally that potentially have some applicability here. And I see you're on mute, just so you know.
Yeah, I mentioned on the chat that the Dutch have been able to do so many excellent pilot projects and learn so much, partly because they commit to spending 2% of their gross domestic product every year on flooding and flood adaptation, because frankly, their alternative is to move to Germany, and that is not on their happy list. So if California spent 2% of GDP annually, our state GDP, that'd be about $50 billion a year. So we're not taking it as seriously as the Dutch, and yet the Bay Area, coastal parts of California that risk landslides are very much at risk. And there's a lot of capacity, economic capacity, whether it's the highways or Facebook, that's at risk. So we have to start taking it seriously and putting dollar signs on our pilot projects so we can start learning more about how to scale up what Dr. Boyer was talking about. And then in terms of other ways of making things happen, people have used private sector development partners, but you have to have development to happen. You have to be willing to accept higher density to do that kind of partnering with private sector. The big nut to crack is state transportation budgets. Once we start getting Caltrans to focus on what the future is of these different highway segments, then there will be a lot of money moving very quickly, and it may move in a way you don't like. So it'd be better if we could attract Caltrans to this conversation in this decade and not wait for them to do some stuff that we don't appreciate in the next decade when they mobilize billions of dollars to protect interstates. Of course, there's the Parks Bond, Prop 68, there's Measure AA. Those are great, but they tend to be small pots of money. Anything that's in the 1 million to 10 million range is good for some pilot projects, but it's not good for the real deal. That's going to have to be in the 50 to 100 million range. So we have to figure out how to scale that up. And then homeowners really need to think about how their adaptation is linked to their adjacent roadways. What will the county do with its roads? What will the city do with its roads? And how will that affect your property? And also parks as a potential coastal protection to reduce wave energy, as Dr. Boyer was talking about, because that's going to let you stay for an extra couple of decades potentially, if you can get that wave energy reduced. So that living edge is really crucial. We're trying to thicken the edge of the bay and allow people to stay longer in individual properties along the shoreline also. So those are pretty much the sources. We're talking about for the whole Bay Area. I've done a cost estimate with grad students and economists at Cal, and we're thinking that for 1 meter of sea level rise, 3 feet, we're looking at maybe a $60 billion purchase to raise everything we have by 3 feet. So we really need to scale up how we're thinking about this and try things. Otherwise, it'll all be up to the roads and what they do.
Well, that is a perfect segue to a couple other questions that have come up here. And those are, the state of California, you presented the Ocean Protection Council projections for sea level rise, and that they have sort of a risk-based choices of numbers. And so it raises this sort of question of timeframes of planning, how much sea level rise to plan for, and link it back to the part that we haven't talked about whatsoever, of course, which is that those different projections are reflections of different greenhouse gas emission scenarios and conceivably the ability to sequester greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere. And those are very linked. So maybe each one of you might have something you want to say about the idea of projections and timeframes and human choices and how these fit together.
Well, we know it's pretty difficult to project beyond about mid-century because, you know, of course, we hope that we'll do something about carbon emissions. And if we do, you know, that could enter into our equation, right, as to, you know, how much more we can expect in the next 50 years after that. So it is a tricky thing to try to make those kinds of projections at this point with there being a lot of unknowns. So the nearer term is better predicted than the further away term. And you'll see a lot of predictions only going to 2100 as though everything's going to stop at 2100 because nobody wants to take it beyond that point. But of course, we know it's not going to stop at 2100.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point I could pick up on. If we're on a steep curve, it's just going to be accelerating more and more at 2100. So I think of this as almost an intergenerational equity question. It's our CO2. It's American CO2. If you look at the bucket of how much CO2 in total is in the atmosphere, most of it comes from the United States in spite of China and India's recent contributions. How can we leave a legacy for future generations to be able to live with the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere? And even if sea level rise isn't going to be a disaster until 2120, it's our CO2. We should be leaving a legacy, not building things that are going to have to be replaced and protected by future generations. And the wetland edge, the living shoreline, that's an example of a legacy that we could leave. We could be the Green New Deal generation that makes this happen. Well, we can build a bunch of junky concrete stuff that needs to be taken out and done over again 30 years from now. So we have to really think this through. What do we want to leave as our legacy when we know sea level is rising and it's not going to stop no matter what we do? Most people that I talk to think 10 feet is pretty much a given now. We just don't know when. It might be, if we're lucky, 2150, but it's coming. And it could be worse.
And we have,
how
what's
would
interesting,
yeah,
we
how
have
would
a
you
class.
describe that?
We have a class with high school students as well as with adults. It's an intern training program. We've been working with Dr. Hill, and we're getting ready to go to phase 2, and that is to be able to bring in more folks to learn about these adaptation strategies, and then to really get more involved in the financial aspect of it. And so we could then make recommendations to not just our county, but go to the region, look at the federal government, just look at a variety of financial sources. But yeah, the whole issue of looking at the dredging of the pond, looking at the whole emissions issues. I mean, these are things that we're talking about it, and I'm excited. But if you met some of our interns, you will feel their excitement about learning these strategies, and it's just fascinating. But we need to see something happen. So that's where we are. We got to see some movement happening.
Okay, thanks all three of you. So there's questions that come in also about West Marin, which may be less in the speaker's bailiwicks, but the question about what is being done out there, both in terms of shoreline projects and questions of groundwater intrusion. I guess they have some different kind of groundwater intrusion issues in West Marin, and I don't know if perhaps Dr. Boyer or Dr. Hill can comment on some of the West Marin challenges and opportunities.
I'd be happy to say a little bit about that. I used to work in the East Coast on Virginia Beach, and that's kind of in some ways a similar shoreline, not as rocky, not the bluffs, but the problem with West Marin is that sand is going to move. So we think that right now we have sand ridges, sand bars, sand spits that keep out some of that wave energy. But as the sea level rises, and what we expect the wave energy to actually increase as a function of a warming planet and more energy in the atmosphere. So as the wave energy increases and the level of the sea rises, that sand is going to be pulled back into the littoral zone off of the beach and move in whatever the gradient is of sand sediment transport. So the beaches could move south. That would be really awful, because then those lagoons would be exposed at Bolinas and at Stinson Beach, and that's going to be a huge vulnerability. So one of the things that people are doing on sandy coastlines, like the Dutch with a lot of sand, is they're dredging sand and piling it up in something called a sand engine. They pile up a big artificial spit of sand, and the wave energy moves it. It's like the myth of Sisyphus. The energy moves the sand, they go get it, and they bring it back. It's very expensive, and it's permanent. They're going to have to keep placing the sand, chasing it, placing it, chasing it, placing it. So it's a long-term commitment. But as I said, the Dutch think that that's part of who they are and what they want to do. So Ocean Beach in San Francisco was kind of a similar situation. The sand is moving north towards the Golden Gate, and the commitment is to go get it up there and bring it back to the south end of Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Those kinds of techniques could be used, but there can be conflicts also with kelp beds and other habitat. The question of where you're going to get the sand from without creating a negative ecological impact. I don't know if Kathy knows anything else about that she'd like to share, but sand is, and cobble beaches are your friend if you're on the open ocean, and you can't really use a wetland, I don't think, to deal with the Pacific Ocean energy and waves. just not going to work.
No, there are some efforts in that are not very far along yet in Bolinas Lagoon and Tamales Bay to do work with wetlands, with eelgrass, potentially native oysters, reef structure for native oysters. And so that sort of planning is underway. And I think there are quite a few things that can be done in both of those places where there's protection, right? We're not talking about the open coast now, the beaches like Kristina is mentioning. We're talking about the protected areas within those bays. So the same kind of techniques that we're doing in San Francisco Bay are possible for shorelines that are more protected, like along Bolinas and Tamales.
Okay, thank you. There's a question I saw that's a little bit up here for Dr. Hill that earlier questions, and this has to do with the relationship between geology and the idea of groundwater issues at the shoreline. And one of the examples for a comparative perspective is at the rock quarry in San Rafael, where they have a 300-foot deep, 300-foot below sea level hole in the ground, and there's not a groundwater issue there apparently. How much is known, and how does the local geology fit into the understanding and maybe some spatial differences with a groundwater intrusion with sea level rise?
That's a great question. There's a lot of debate about whether the bay mud is actually going to keep the sea level, the pressure of rising seawater from raising the freshwater groundwater. Will the bay mud act as a cap? Or will it just come around the edges of the bay mud and fill up anyway? Because the whole system is so leaky, and we're talking about a new equilibrium, not a temporary high water level, but a new permanent high water level. And when you have permanent high water, there's a lot more time for water to come in from all sides and raise the permanent level of the groundwater table. So there's that. Bay mud may prevent some groundwater from rising, at least temporarily. In areas where it's alluvium, like it's gravel or mixed sands and gravel, in those areas, groundwater is very mobile and it'll rise very quickly. So Alameda, some parts of San Rafael may see very rapid groundwater movement. And that's something that we just have to accept and plan for. There are also bedrock areas and bluffs that are either bedrock or friable material that may erode with wave energy at the base, like Pacifica has. And those areas look like they're safe, but they're not safe because the wave energy is going to undercut them and they'll just collapse. The bedrock ones are the ones that are likely to stay around for thousands of years, even as sea level rises. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense. The geology is the key. That's my first degree. So of course, I think geology is the root of all knowledge. So definitely geology is the key to understanding this. And there's a lot of debate going on still about how that will play out.
Okay, let me switch to some questions here around transportation corridor Marin County. So Highway 101 drops down right in front of Marin City, goes through, Marin, it has the hill and valley topography. So every valley is low and is either at or very vulnerable to sea level rise. Up and down through the whole county, central Santa Fe, the Caltrans wanted to spend $20 million to rebuild the off-ramp from 101 and at grade. And at king tides, the water's less than a foot below the roadbed. So the question would be, thinking up and down the Marin shoreline, how might the ideas that have been talked about tonight contribute to addressing the risk that the 101 and I guess 580 in Santa Fe have in terms of the transportation corridor within Marin County and how that corridor is important for Northern California more broadly? I'll leave it to all three.
Do you want
on that?
Yeah, there's not all that much that I can say about the highway up 101. are we talking, sorry, could you repeat, are we talking about at Marin City, or are we talking about at up through San Rafael?
Well, I'm thinking each of the low-lying areas, in each of them, you know, for the most part, the water's not at the edge of the freeway. And so, although it is in Marin City, and then, so strategies that might be effective because the bay is at 101 in Marin City, and then further north, the bay is set back a little ways as other lands, be they developed or open space lands. How might some of these strategies be employed to protect these different kinds of settings for 101 through Marin County? And so, for example, in San Rafael, living shorelines and so forth that that protect the Spinnaker Bay Point Canal neighborhood, as an example, and southeast San Rafael might have one set of strategies. Marin City, where the bay is right across the freeway from Marin City, is a very different kind of setting. So those are good contrasts, I suppose, to talk about.
Yeah, well, one thing I could say is that, you know, some of what we would need to do along any of these shorelines is to build some of these green infrastructure type projects out into the bay. In some cases, there isn't a lot of room. There isn't a wetland already present. And so, you know, there's lots of ideas and some pilots to build wetlands out from the currently, you know, rip-wrapped or otherwise armored structures that line our shores. And in doing that, you know, if we put in, say, a whole series of reefs, I showed a picture that came from one of the efforts in the Resilient by Design challenge. That was in 2018. If people aren't familiar with it, there was a project focused in San Rafael specifically. There's one focused specifically around Marin City. And one idea, just part of the puzzle that was sort of presented from the group in San Rafael was a large series of reefs that could help to break waves. And with the idea being that would be combined with eelgrass plantings potentially to increase habitat value and also do some water energy reduction in itself. And then if there would be the possibility of building wetlands as well, out from some of these existing shores, that would be an opportunity.
Okay, and Terry, from Marin City, that is right next to the highway there, tackling both the pond issue and then looking at and thinking of the slide that Kristina Hill presented that showed essentially taking out the shopping mall and making that back into some version of a detention basin / wetland, and then try to think about how the very low line 101 fits there. Has the community there been come up with ideas or thoughts around how to tackle that transportation in combination with addressing the flooding issue in Marin City?
We just been talking about, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm having a little problem trying to open up the screen.
We hear you.
Okay, so we've been looking and talking about different designs, and one might be to really look at a canal where you really open up the middle of the shopping center, and but we clearly need to have grocery stores, some essential services, and so it's like, how do we maybe have 2-story buildings on both sides of the shopping center, and you have the canal right in the middle. So, I mean, we're having some discussions, but again, we need to be able to access funding ourselves so we can be able to bring in some more experts to help us really look at the possibilities. So, yes.
Yeah, I would say in relation to that imagine if Caltrans decides to raise Highway 101 on a causeway where it goes along the Richardson Bay shoreline. That would be a big difference, because that means the ocean will come in under the causeway and flood all those bays, including the tidal lagoon in Marin City. On the other hand, Caltrans could decide to raise the highway on a berm of earth with just a few little culverts underneath. And that means we're back in the bathtub situation in Marin City, and in other parts of the Bay Edge, there'll be other kinds of drainage problems. Anytime you create a pipe that goes underneath the highway, you've set the maximum amount of water that can flow through by the size of that pipe. So you've created a choke point, and that's going to create flooding under certain circumstances. So what Caltrans decides to do, if it does the expensive thing, which is a causeway, or it does the cheap thing, which is the earthen berm, that's going to have huge impacts on everybody on the inland side of 101. And if we used reefs and wetlands to try to maintain 101 where it is right now for as long as possible, we can reduce the wave energy, and the temporary storm surge events won't be as big a deal for flooding. But if the groundwater comes up anyway, then you've still got a problem you've got to deal with by raising the road one way or another. So it's all going to come looping back around to what Caltrans decides to do with state highways and federal highways in the Bay Edge, because so much of the Bay Edge is close to roads. And then other parts of it, like Novato, those are huge areas with many more options. And what they'll have to do is decide to move dirt around, pile it up, cut it away, figure out how to balance the cut and fill, and put the housing either on floating on the water or up on the fill. It's like a big sandbox experiment that we'll be taking on in those areas that stick out into the bay. Like Belmarin Keys, that was an experiment for its time. What will our new experiment be over the next 20 years?
So
somebody just mentioned, if I could just close one point there, somebody wrote in the chat, Caltrans could just raise the, Jack said Caltrans could just raise the adjacent bike path. Yeah, but if groundwater is coming up anyway, then that levee won't make any difference. So we have to really think not just about the ocean water and its waves and its tides, but also about groundwater coming up through the soil, or we'll waste our money. We'll think we're protecting ourselves from flooding, and we won't be. Sorry, Anna.
Oh, no, that's fine. I just wanted to say Jack Leibster, who's I think a planning commissioner in San Rafael, wanted to share that Marin County is evaluating cobble beaches with dunes to protect shorelines because they're thinking that might be an approach that could scale up and help protect things. But I need to point out we're running close to time. Stuart, do you want to ask one last question and then we can wrap up for the evening?
Sure. I'm trying to finish. There's a number of questions here, so I'm trying to think of the conversation.
Spoiled for choice.
It's really maybe I'll let me just kind of glance through all these questions here, and I maybe I'll take one and turn it into a interesting challenge question. Is that kind of follow from earlier one about the difference between adaptation and this broad concept of mitigation, and maybe have folks kind of close with their thoughts of how we as a society might want to be looking at where we put our resources into adaptation efforts and into mitigation efforts, so that how much we deal with what's coming now and how much we try to head off what the worst might be coming in the future. And it's a bit of an existential question, but it's a very relevant question at the same time. And so those might be good sort of closing thoughts from each of you.
Well, I would say that, really all of these decisions are societal. We're going to decide where we want to put our funding. We're going to decide whether or not we have enough funding to do the things that some of us would like to see happen. And or are we going to put probably a lot more funding into just throwing up seawalls everywhere and probably not solving a number of the problems that we've talked about tonight. So I would say, it's heartening to me that we are willing to tax ourselves. And I think there's a lot more capacity to ask people to do that, or for us, our government institutions to choose to put funding that, in those kinds of pots toward these kinds of adaptation measures. It's going to be up to us to decide whether or not we think these are important things. We could just retreat, or we could decide that we want to still have habitat. And of course, that's That's what I'm plugging, because I think in the Bay Area, we appreciate that habitat and we want to see it persist into the future. So my hope would be that we make decisions that allow for us to have wildlife and plants and the beauty that these things bring to us, and that give us so much pleasure in the Bay Area and are a great reason why we want to live here. That we can find ways to continue to have those kinds of features present across our landscapes and seascapes.
I would just add to that to me, the biodiversity component is also super functional. I mean, what we're seeing right now with COVID-19, that's a wild ecosystem origin disease. In California, we have the buffer of greater biodiversity and more habitat that protects us from diseases like Lyme disease, where we see it less commonly, partly because of interactions among lizards and the ticks and deer and cougar, which Kathy and her colleagues at San Francisco State have been doing a lot more with than I know of people working on at Berkeley. Maybe people saw the article in Bay Nature that tied biodiversity into our lower rate of Lyme disease recently. We need the biodiversity. We need it for functional reasons for our own health. In order to prevent epidemics like the one that we're seeing now, we've got to have the bugs and the bats and everything else interacting. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves on the front lines of pathogens that'll take out humans. So this is essential that we, Paul Ehrlich used to say, you know, if you're taking screws out of an airplane, how many screws would you let the mechanic take out before you would refuse to fly? I think we need to stop taking screws out of the airplane wings and keep our biodiversity for our own benefit, and then figure out how we're going to be able to live with this higher water. We need a plan to live with it. We can't wall it out. So let's be creative. Let's take it on. Let's think of ourselves as a creative region and imagine our shared resourcefulness. Imagine our compassion for others who aren't experiencing what we are, and keep in the forefront of our minds that California is probably the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. If we can't find the money to adapt, who can? It's only because of a more robust social contract that countries like the Netherlands, Scandinavia are able to do this adaptation work. We need to beef up our social contract and be there for each other and learn to be more resilient and treat places like Marin City and the Canal District as the leaders that they really are. They know how to be resilient, and we can help them and then learn from their model. That's what I would say. And mitigation is critical, but the horse has left the barn on sea level rise. It's coming anyway. So while mitigation is absolutely essential, so is adaptation.
Totally agree with what you both said. And I'm thinking right now that yes, we can find the money to adapt, but right now is for the residents that live in Marin City, we need to find the money and the will to be able to deal with the issue that we have on hand right now. And, you know, it's like we're drowning. Are we going to tread water, or are we going to swim? You know, so let's try to deal with the issue we have on hand. And at the same time, we could be doing the planning for the long term, but we need some help right now because we're drowning. We are drowning.
Wow, well, that's a great conclusion. Actually, Stuart, I thought that final question was a great question because it really does highlight some of what we're facing right now and what we will be facing in the near future and some of the challenges and what are we going to do about them. I think that's a terrific note to leave us on because like we've been saying, you know, EFM is not just about environmental education, it's about encouraging people to understand so that we can take more informed action. So I want to thank everybody, Terry, Kristina, Kathy, and Stuart for that great discussion and for all the knowledge you've shared with us this evening. We appreciate your expertise and your willingness to work with us in this webinar format. And same goes to you, our patient audience. We'd like to thank you for being part of our very first ever webinar Apologies for any of the technical glitches you experienced. We will be putting a link to this up on our homepage so that you can take a look at it if you had screen issues or something was going on. Well, we hope you will enjoy learning from our experts about how rising sea levels and groundwater levels are likely to impact Marin and are already impacting Marin and what we can start doing about it. So we'll be following up in the